There's a certain kind of person who moves through the world like a ghost at a party. They're there, they see everything, but they rarely speak. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned something most people never will. That the world reveals more when you stop trying to fill every silence. Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe you are someone like this. The one who sits at the edge of conversations, listening without performing. The one who notices the micro-expressions, the tone shifts, the things people don't say out loud. The one who can sit in a room full of noise and still feel completely alone, not because they're disconnected, but because they're processing everything at a depth no one else seems to reach. They don't interrupt. They don't compete for attention. They don't need to prove they're the smartest person in the room, and because of that, people often misunderstand them. They call them shy, cold, disinterested, aloof. But the truth is far more complex, and if you've ever felt invisible while being surrounded by people, if you've ever wondered why you can't just speak up like everyone else seems to, if you've ever felt guilty for preferring to watch rather than participate, then this is for you. Because the psychology of the quiet observer runs deeper than most people realize, and understanding it might be the key to finally making peace with who you've always been. Let me tell you what most people don't understand about quiet observers. They're not empty, they're not absent, they're not checked out. They're doing something most people have forgotten how to do. They're paying attention, real attention, the kind that notices when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes, the kind that picks up on the slight hesitation before someone answers a question, the kind that can feel the shift in energy when a conversation turns uncomfortable. Psychologically, this isn't just a personality trait, it's a cognitive orientation. Researchers call it perceptual sensitivity. It means your brain processes environmental stimuli more deeply than most. You're not just hearing words, you're reading subtext, tone, body language, micro-expressions, and the 1,000 tiny signals people send without realizing it. It's like you're watching a movie while everyone else is reading the subtitles. They get the basic plot, but you see the cinematography, the lighting, the score, the director's hidden meanings. And here's what's fascinating. This isn't something you chose. It's how your nervous system was calibrated, probably very early in life. Maybe you grew up in a household where reading the room meant survival, where you had to sense your parents' mood before you spoke, where emotional volatility taught you to become a radar for danger. So you learned to watch, to listen, to decode. Not because you were naturally introverted, but because hypervigilance became your safety protocol. But even if your childhood was stable, the pattern still makes sense, because some brains are just wired differently. Neuroscientist Elaine Aron calls this sensory processing sensitivity. About 15 to 20% of the population has it. These are people whose brains process information more thoroughly. They notice subtleties. They reflect before reacting. They need time to think, and in a world that rewards quick responses, loud voices, and constant performance, this kind of processing feels like a disadvantage. But it's not. It's just different. Because while everyone else is talking at each other, you're actually listening to them. While they're performing, you're understanding. While they're competing for airtime, you're absorbing the truth beneath the noise, and that's not weakness, that's depth. But here's where it gets complicated. Because even though your observation is a gift, it often feels like loneliness. You're surrounded by people, but you're not with them. You're watching them like you're behind glass. You can see everything, but you can't quite reach through. And when you do try to speak, when you finally gather your thoughts and open your mouth, someone else has already filled the space. The conversation has moved on, so you close your mouth again. You tell yourself it didn't matter anyway. You convince yourself you're fine just watching. But deep down, you wonder if anyone notices you're even there. There's something quietly devastating about being the person who always has the perfect thing to say 3 hours after the conversation ends. Quiet observers live in this space constantly, not because they're slow, not because they're unintelligent, but because their minds work in layers. When someone asks them a question, their brain doesn't just grab the first answer, it scans for the truest answer, the most accurate one, the one that accounts for context, nuance, and all the possible interpretations, and by the time they've found it, the moment is gone. If this is you, I need you to know something. You're not broken. You're not socially defective. You're just thinking in a world that rewards reacting. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon. It's related to something called reflective processing versus reactive processing, Most people operate in reactive mode during conversations. They hear something, and they respond immediately based on association, emotion, or social expectation. But reflective processes like you take an extra beat. They consider, they evaluate, they search for truth, not just a response. And in fast-paced social settings, that extra beat costs you visibility. But here's what most people never understand. Your silence isn't empty, it's full. It's overflowing with thoughts you haven't found the right words for yet. You're not withholding, you're processing. You're not disengaged, you're absorbing everything. And that absorption, that constant intake of information, emotion and energy, it's exhausting. Because while everyone else gets to externalize their thoughts immediately, you hold yours inside, turning them over like stones, examining every facet before deciding if they're worth sharing. And often, by the time you decide, you've convinced yourself they're not. It's probably not important. They won't care anyway. Someone else already said something similar. I'll just sound stupid. These are the scripts that run in your mind. Not because they're true, but because when you've been talked over enough times, when your pauses have been filled by louder voices enough times, your brain learns a painful lesson. My voice doesn't matter as much as theirs, and that belief, once formed, becomes a filter. It shapes how you see every interaction. You start editing yourself before you speak. You question whether your thoughts are valuable enough to interrupt the flow. You become your own gatekeeper, not because the world told you to be quiet, but because you learned that your kind of communication doesn't fit the pace everyone else operates at. But here's the truth they never tell you. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people like you, people who think before they speak, people who listen without planning their response, people who can hold space for silence without needing to fill it. Because in a culture addicted to reaction, reflection is revolutionary. And maybe the reason you feel so out of place is because you're not meant to blend in. You're meant to observe, to notice, to understand what everyone else is too busy performing to see. But that doesn't make it easier, because even when you know your observation has value, you still wonder what it would feel like to just speak without hesitation, to raise your hand first, to interrupt without guilt, to take up space the way others do so effortlessly. You watch people who talk without thinking, and part of you envies them, not because you want to be careless with your words, but because you want to feel that freedom, that ease, that sense that your voice belongs in the room just as much as anyone else's. And when you don't feel that, when you stay quiet one more time, when you let another moment pass without contributing, you go home and replay it. Over and over and over. Why didn't I just say it? Why am I like this? Why can't I just be normal? But what if normal isn't the goal? What if the goal is understanding who you actually are and learning to exist in the world without apologizing for it? Here's what happens when you spend years watching instead of speaking. You become extraordinary at reading people. Not in a manipulative way, not in a calculating way, but in a deeply human way. You notice things, the way someone's voice changes when they talk about their family, the micropause before they answer a personal question, the forced brightness in their "I'm fine." You see the performance, and you see the person beneath it. That's a rare gift. Because most people are so focused on what they're going to say next that they miss what's actually being communicated. They hear words, you hear meaning, they see behavior, you see patterns, they notice reactions. You notice roots. This is what psychologists call empathic accuracy, the ability to correctly infer another person's internal state. And studies show that people who score high on this tend to be observers, the ones who talk less, listen more, and process deeply. Because empathy isn't just about feeling, it's about noticing, and you can't notice what you're not paying attention to. That's why quiet observers often make the best friends, the best therapists, the best partners, not because they have all the answers, but because they create space for truth. They don't rush to fix. They don't interrupt with their own story. They don't minimize what you're feeling. They just see you. And in a world where most people are desperately trying to be seen themselves, that kind of attention is medicine. But here's the paradox. Even though you can see others so clearly, you often feel invisible yourself. Because the same sensitivity that makes you good at reading people also makes you acutely aware when you're being overlooked. You notice when someone cuts you off. You feel it when your comment goes unacknowledged. You register every moment where your presence seems optional. And it hurts. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, accumulating way. Each small invisibility adds to the others, until one day you realize you've built an entire identity around not being noticed. And you start to wonder, if you disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for anyone to notice? That thought lives in the minds of many quiet observers, not because they're dramatic, not because they're attention-seeking, but because when you spend your whole life watching others be seen, you can't help but wonder what that would feel like for you. But here's what I need you to understand. Your quietness is not a flaw to fix. It's not a barrier to overcome. It's not something you need to apologize for. It's a way of being in the world that has its own kind of power. Think about it. In every conversation, someone has to hold the space. Someone has to listen deeply enough to understand what's actually being said. Someone has to notice the undercurrents, the unspoken tensions, the emotional truths that everyone else is too busy talking to see. That someone is you. And without you, conversations become performances. Monologues disguised as dialogue. People waiting for their turn to speak instead of actually connecting. You're not failing at conversation. You're operating at a different frequency, one that values depth over speed, truth over performance, understanding over being understood. And yes, that frequency can be lonely, because not everyone can meet you there. Not everyone wants to go that deep. Not everyone has the patience for the kind of communication you crave, but that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it differently. There's something you need to know about the way quiet observers experience relationships. They don't collect people. They don't need a crowd. They're not interested in surface-level friendships where you talk about everything and say nothing. What they crave is one person who gets it. One person who can sit in comfortable silence. One person who doesn't need them to perform, explain, or justify their way of being. And when they find that person, when they finally meet someone who can match their depth, something beautiful happens. They open up, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, carefully, like a flower that only blooms at night. They reveal layers most people never knew existed, the thoughts they've been carrying alone, the observations they've been storing, the questions they've been turning over in their minds for years. And suddenly, all that watching, all that listening, all that silent processing becomes a gift they can finally share. Because quiet observers don't just notice the world, they notice the meaning in it. They see patterns in human behavior that others miss. They understand emotional dynamics that most people never consciously recognize. They carry a kind of wisdom that only comes from truly paying attention. But here's the thing, that wisdom is often invisible, because wisdom doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't demand to be heard. It waits, and it trusts that the people who need it will eventually find it. That's what makes being a quiet observer so paradoxical. You have so much to offer, but you're wired to offer it quietly. You see so clearly, but you rarely point out what you see unless someone asks. You understand so deeply, but you hesitate to share that understanding because you're not sure anyone wants to hear it. So you carry it, all of it, the insights, the observations, the unspoken truths, and it becomes a weight you didn't ask for but can't seem to put down. Let me tell you what happens to quiet observers over time. They start to develop an internal world that's richer, more complex, and more vivid than anything happening around them. They think in metaphors, they notice symbolism in everyday moments, they find meaning in things other people dismiss as mundane. A conversation becomes a study in human nature, a silence becomes a question, a glance becomes an entire story. And because they spend so much time in their own minds, they become incredibly self-aware. They know their patterns, they understand their triggers, they can trace their emotional reactions back to their roots with startling accuracy. This is both a gift and a burden, because self-awareness without self-compassion becomes self-criticism, and many quiet observers fall into this trap. They watch themselves the same way they watch others, with the same attention to detail, the same analysis, the same search for meaning. But when you turn that lens inward, it can become harsh. You start to see all your hesitations as failures, all your silences as missed opportunities, all your observations as proof that you're on the outside looking in. You forget that watching is not the same as not participating, that silence is not the same as absence, that your way of being in the world is just as valid as anyone else's. And this is where the real work begins, not in becoming louder, not in forcing yourself to speak more, but in accepting that your quiet presence has value exactly as it is. Because the world needs observers. It needs people who can step back and see the bigger picture. It needs people who notice what everyone else is too busy to see. It needs people who can hold complexity without needing to simplify it. That's you. That's what you bring. And it matters more than you realize. There's a question quiet observers ask themselves all the time. Am I too much in my head? Am I overthinking this? Should I just stop analyzing everything and just be? And the answer is both yes and no. Yes, there are times when analysis becomes a defense mechanism, when thinking becomes a way to avoid feeling, when observation becomes a way to stay safe from vulnerability. But no, you're not broken for processing the world this way. You're not defective for needing time to think. You're not wrong for seeing layers that others don't. The key is learning when to observe and when to engage, when to think and when to feel, when to watch and when to participate. And that balance, that's the real challenge for quiet observers, because your default mode is to step back, to create distance, to process before responding. And while that serves you in many ways, it can also keep you from fully experiencing life. Because life isn't just something to be understood, it's something to be felt. And sometimes the truest moments are the ones you can't analyze, the ones that don't make sense, the ones that bypass your brain entirely and land directly in your heart. Those moments require you to stop watching and start being, to stop thinking and start feeling, to stop observing from the outside and step fully into the experience. And that's terrifying for someone who's built their entire identity around careful observation, because stepping into the moment means losing control. It means not knowing what's going to happen next. It means trusting that you don't need to analyze everything to be safe. But here's what I've learned. The most meaningful moments in life are the ones you don't see coming, the ones that catch you off guard, the ones that happen when you finally let your guard down. And if you're always watching, always analyzing, always one step removed, you might miss them. So here's what I want you to consider. What would it feel like to trust your presence without needing to justify it? What would it feel like to speak without having the perfect words? What would it feel like to contribute to a conversation even if your thought isn't fully formed? What would it feel like to take up space without apologizing for it? I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm not asking you to suddenly become loud, extroverted, or performative. I'm asking you to stop treating your quietness as something that needs to be fixed, because it doesn't. You don't need to be fixed, you need to be understood. And the first person who needs to understand you is you. You need to stop seeing your observation as a barrier and start seeing it as a bridge between the surface of life and its deeper meaning, a bridge between what people say and what they actually mean, a bridge between the noise of the world and the quiet truth beneath it. You are that bridge, and the world needs you exactly as you are. Not louder, not more outgoing, not more like everyone else, but more like yourself. More grounded in the unique way you experience the world, more confident in the value of your perspective, more willing to share what you see even if it comes out imperfectly. Because your observations, your insights, your quiet wisdom, they matter, even when no one acknowledges them. Even when they go unnoticed, even when you're the only one who knows they exist, they still matter. There's a kind of freedom that comes when you stop waiting to be understood and start understanding yourself. When you stop apologizing for your quietness and start honoring it. When you stop seeing your observation as a flaw and start seeing it as a gift. Not because the world suddenly validates you, but because you finally validate yourself. You realize that you don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to matter. You don't need to dominate conversations to have value. You don't need to perform extroversion to prove you're engaged. You just need to show up as yourself. Quiet, observant, thoughtful, deep, and trust that the right people will see you. Not because you demanded to be seen, but because your presence, quiet as it is, creates a space that others recognize as safe. That's the gift of the quiet observer. Not that you see everything, but that you create space for others to be seen. Not that you have all the answers, but that you ask the questions no one else thinks to ask. Not that you're the most interesting person in the room, but that you're genuinely interested in everyone else. And in a world full of people trying to be heard, that kind of listening is revolutionary. So if you've spent your whole life feeling like you're on the outside looking in, maybe it's time to reframe that. Maybe you're not on the outside, maybe you're just seeing from a different angle, one that allows you to notice things others miss, one that gives you perspective others don't have. And maybe that perspective, quiet as it is exactly what the world needs more of. Let me tell you one final truth about quiet observers. They often underestimate their impact. They think because they don't speak loudly, they don't leave a mark. They think because they don't dominate conversations, they don't influence people. They think because they observe from the sidelines, they're not really part of the story. But that's not true, because the quiet ones are often the ones people remember most, not for what they said, but for how they made people feel, seen, heard, understood. There's a reason people come to you when they need to talk. There's a reason they trust you with their secrets. There's a reason they feel safe in your presence. It's not because you have all the answers. It's because you don't pretend to. It's because you listen without judgment. It's because you create space without demanding it. It's because your quietness feels like permission for others to be honest. That's power. Real power. The kind that doesn't announce itself but changes everything. So no, you're not too quiet. You're not too in your head. You're not failing at life because you don't operate the way everyone else does. You're just operating at a different frequency. One that values depth over noise, presence over performance, truth over comfort. And the world, whether it realizes it or not, desperately needs people like you. People who watch without needing to interrupt. People who listen without needing to fix. People who observe without needing to explain. Because in all that watching, all that listening, all that quiet observation, you're doing something most people have forgotten how to do. You're paying attention to what's real, and maybe that's the most important thing anyone can do. So if you've ever felt invisible, know this: you're not invisible. You're just waiting to be seen by the right eyes, the ones that recognize depth, the ones that value stillness, the ones that understand that silence is not emptiness. And when those eyes find you, when that person finally sees you, you'll realize something profound. You were never broken. You were never too much or not enough. You were just different. Beautifully, powerfully, necessarily different. And that difference, quiet as it is exactly what makes you unforgettable. But let's talk about where this pattern actually begins, because most quiet observers didn't start out this way. There was a time, probably before you can even remember, when you had no filter between your thoughts and your voice, when you spoke freely, asked questions endlessly, and believed that what you had to say mattered. Something changed that. Maybe slowly, maybe all at once. For some, it was a parent who was too tired to listen. Not cruel, just overwhelmed. So when you came running with excitement about something you'd discovered, they nodded absently, eyes still on their phone, and your brain, always watching, always learning, registered that moment. It filed it away under a category that would shape you for years to come. My enthusiasm is inconvenient. For others, it was a classroom. You raised your hand with the answer, waited patiently to be called on, but the teacher moved past you to someone louder, someone who didn't wait, someone who just shouted it out. And in that moment, you learned that waiting, that respect for structure, that thoughtfulness, it doesn't always get rewarded. Sometimes it just gets overlooked. Or maybe it was a friendship. You shared something personal, something that felt important, and your friend laughed. Not maliciously. They probably didn't even remember it 5 minutes later, but you did. You remember the exact look on their face, the way your chest tightened, the decision you made in that instant to be more careful next time. These moments, they seem small, insignificant even. But to a sensitive child, to someone whose brain is wired to process deeply, these moments become data points. Evidence in a case you're building against your own voice. And over time, you stop raising your hand. You stop sharing freely. You stop believing that what you have to say is worth the risk of being ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood. You become an observer not by choice, but by adaptation. It's a survival strategy, a way to stay safe in a world that feels unpredictable. Psychologists call this learned inhibition. It's when a natural impulse to speak, to share, to connect gets suppressed over time because the environment doesn't reinforce it. And what's fascinating is that this doesn't just change your behavior, it changes your brain. Studies using neuroimaging have shown that people who grew up in environments where their voice wasn't valued develop different activation patterns in the brain regions associated with self-expression. The anterior cingulate cortex, which helps you assess whether it's safe to speak, becomes hyperactive. It's constantly scanning for signs of rejection, dismissal, or negative judgment. So when you're in a conversation and you have something to say, your brain isn't just thinking about what to say, it's running a rapid-fire risk assessment. Will this be well received? Is this the right moment? Am I reading the room correctly? What if I'm wrong? And by the time your brain completes that assessment, the moment has passed. Someone else has spoken. The conversation has moved on, and you're left with that familiar feeling of being a step behind, a beat too slow, perpetually on the outside of the rhythm everyone else seems to naturally understand. But here's what most people don't realize. That assessment process, that careful evaluation, it's not a flaw. It's actually a highly sophisticated form of social intelligence. You're not slow. You're thorough. You're not overthinking. You're thinking at a depth most people don't even know exists. The problem isn't your processing speed. The problem is that you're operating in a culture that values reaction time over reflection quality. That rewards the first answer over the best answer. That mistakes speed for intelligence and silence for absence. There's another layer to this that rarely gets discussed. Quiet observers often have a complicated relationship with their own needs. They learn early on that asking for things, asking for attention, asking for help, it comes with a cost. Maybe that cost is guilt. Maybe it's the fear of being too much. Maybe it's the deeply internalized belief that other people's needs are more legitimate than their own. So they develop what psychologists call self-silencing. It's a pattern where you actively suppress your own thoughts, feelings, and needs in order to maintain relationships and avoid conflict. On the surface, this can look like selflessness, like emotional maturity, like being low maintenance and easy to be around. But underneath, it's exhausting because you're constantly translating yourself, editing in real time, holding back the full truth of what you're experiencing because you've learned that the full truth is often too much for people to handle. You become fluent in a language most people don't even know they're speaking. The language of what's acceptable to share and what needs to stay hidden. What will maintain connection and what might threaten it. And over time you get so good at this translation that you lose touch with the original language. The one where you say exactly what you mean, where you ask for what you need, where you trust that your presence, unfiltered, is enough. This is where the loneliness becomes most acute. Because you can be surrounded by people, you can have friends and family who care about you, and still feel fundamentally alone. Because they don't know the real you. They know the translated version, the carefully curated edition that's been edited for palatability. And you start to wonder if they knew the real you, the one who thinks too much and feels too deeply, and needs more than you're comfortable asking for, would they still want you around? That question, that fear, it keeps you locked in the pattern. It keeps you observing from a safe distance. Because distance, at least, is predictable. You know how to manage distance. What you don't know is how to manage the vulnerability of being fully seen. Let me tell you something about the internal world of a quiet observer. It's vast, intricate, endlessly complex. While everyone else is moving through their day on autopilot, reacting and responding and moving from one thing to the next, you're narrating. You're analysing. You're connecting dots that span years, decades, sometimes your entire life. You see someone laugh a certain way and it reminds you of a conversation you had 5 years ago with someone completely different, and suddenly you're drawing connections between human behavioural patterns that most people would never notice. You overhear a snippet of dialogue, and you can infer the entire relationship dynamic between those two people, their history, their wounds. The things they're not saying but desperately want to. You walk into a room and within 30 seconds you've read the energy, identified the alliances, sensed the undercurrents, and positioned yourself accordingly, not manipulatively, just instinctively. Because that's how your brain has learned to keep you safe. This constant processing, this perpetual analysis, it's both a gift and a weight. Because you see so much, you understand so much, and most of the time you can't share it, because it would sound strange, overly analytical, or like you're making assumptions. So you carry it, all these observations, all these insights, all this understanding of human nature that you've accumulated through years of careful watching, and it becomes a kind of knowledge that isolates you. Because the more you see, the harder it is to find people who see at the same depth. The more you understand, the more alone you feel in that understanding. There's a concept in existential psychology called existential isolation. It's the fundamental recognition that no matter how close we get to another person, we're ultimately alone in our subjective experience. No one can ever fully know what it's like to be us. For most people, this remains an abstract philosophical idea. But for quiet observers, it's a lived reality. Because you spend so much time in your own inner world, you're acutely aware of the gap between your internal experience and what you're able to communicate externally. You know that even when you do speak, even when you try to explain what you're thinking or feeling, something gets lost in translation. The words are never quite precise enough. The other person's interpretation is never quite aligned with your intent, so why bother? That's the question that haunts many quiet observers. If I can never truly be understood, why keep trying to explain myself? And that question, left unanswered, becomes a prison. Because the logical conclusion is to stop trying, to retreat fully into your own mind, to accept that observation from a distance as the closest you'll ever get to real connection. But that's not true. It feels true, but it's not. Here's what changes everything. The recognition that you don't need to be fully understood to be genuinely connected. Connection isn't about perfect comprehension. It's not about finding someone who thinks exactly like you or processes the world in exactly the same way. That's not connection. That's mirroring. And mirroring, while comfortable, doesn't actually create growth or intimacy. Real connection is what happens when two different people, with two different ways of experiencing the world, choose to stay present with each other anyway. When they acknowledge the gap, the difference, the fundamental unknowability of another person's inner world, and decide that it's worth trying to bridge anyway. For quiet observers, this means learning to share your observations even when they're not perfectly articulated. It means speaking even when you haven't found the exact right words. It means trusting that the people who are meant to understand you will make the effort to meet you halfway. And here's the beautiful part. When you do this, when you take the risk of being less than perfectly clear, something unexpected happens. You discover that vulnerability is its own form of communication. When you say, "I don't quite know how to explain this, but here's what I'm noticing," people lean in. When you say, "This might not make sense, but I've been thinking about something," people listen more carefully. When you admit, "I'm not sure I have the right words for this," people become more patient, more curious, more willing to work with you to understand. Because vulnerability signals trust. It signals that you value the relationship enough to risk being misunderstood. And that risk, that willingness to be imperfect, it creates a kind of intimacy that polished, perfectly articulated thoughts never can. This doesn't mean you need to share everything. It doesn't mean you need to externalize every observation or analysis. Some thoughts are meant to stay private. Some processing needs to happen internally. But it does mean learning to discern between the thoughts that need to stay inside and the ones that are staying inside out of fear. Between the observations that serve you by remaining unspoken and the ones that are slowly suffocating you because you've never given them air. Let's talk about what healing looks like for quiet observers. Because healing, in this context, isn't about becoming more extroverted, is not about forcing yourself to speak more, or training yourself to be more spontaneous, or rewiring your brain to process less deeply. Healing is about integration. It's about bringing together all the parts of yourself that you've kept separate. The part that watches and the part that participates. The part that analyzes and the part that feels. The part that stays safe through distance and the part that craves intimacy. It starts with self-compassion. With recognizing that every coping strategy you developed, every pattern of behavior that keeps you on the sidelines, it all made sense once. It all served a purpose. It kept you safe when safety felt uncertain. You're not broken for being this way. You're adapted. And adaptation is intelligence. But adaptation that was necessary in childhood can become limitation in adulthood. The hypervigilance that once protected you might now be keeping you from experiences you actually want. The careful self-editing that once prevented rejection might now be preventing genuine connection. So healing is about asking yourself, with gentleness and curiosity, which patterns are still serving me and which ones am I ready to outgrow? Maybe you're ready to speak up more, not because you should, but because you genuinely want to share your perspective. Maybe you're ready to risk being misunderstood because the alternative, staying silent, feels lonelier than the possibility of being heard imperfectly. Maybe you're ready to stop treating every conversation like a performance you need to perfect and start treating it like an exploration you're willing to navigate messily. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments, in tiny acts of courage that no one else even notices. It's saying yes when your instinct is to say no because you're genuinely interested, not because you feel obligated. It's sharing an observation even when you're not sure how it will land. It's letting yourself be seen in your uncertainty instead of only showing up when you're sure. It's learning that you can be both the observer and the observed, that you can watch and participate simultaneously, that you can hold your analytical nature and your emotional nature at the same time. There's a particular kind of loneliness that quiet observers know intimately. It's the loneliness of being in a room full of people and realizing that you're having a completely different experience than everyone else. They're laughing at something you found only mildly amusing. They're deeply engaged in a topic you find superficial. They're connecting over shared interests that feel, to you, like surface-level distractions from deeper questions. And you start to wonder, am I the problem? Am I too serious? Too deep? Too analytical? The answer is no. You're not the problem. You're just tuned to a different frequency. But that frequency, it can make you feel like an alien in your own life. Like everyone else got a manual for human interaction that you somehow missed. Like there's a language of small talk and social scripts that everyone speaks fluently, while you're still trying to figure out the grammar. Here's what I need you to understand. The fact that you don't naturally speak that language doesn't mean you're socially deficient. It means you're wired for depth in a world that often operates on the surface. And yes, that's harder. Yes, it means you'll feel out of place more often. Yes, it means connection will require more intention, and more courage, and more risk. But it also means that when you do connect, when you find those rare people who operate at your frequency, the connection is profound. It's the kind of friendship where you can sit in silence and it feels like conversation, where you can share a single thought and the other person understands the entire universe behind it. Those connections are rare, but they're real, and they're worth the loneliness of waiting for them. There's a question that haunts many quiet observers, especially in moments of deep loneliness. What if I'm not actually deep? What if I'm just awkward? What if what I've been calling observation is really just social anxiety dressed up as introspection? This is the cruel voice of self-doubt, and it knows exactly where to strike. Because when you've spent your whole life feeling different, it's easy to internalize the message that different means defective. But let me offer you a different perspective. Depth and anxiety can coexist. You can be genuinely introspective and also socially anxious. You can be a keen observer and also struggle with self-doubt. One doesn't negate the other. The fact that you question your own depth is actually evidence of your depth. Because superficial thinkers don't spend time wondering if they think too much. They don't question the validity of their own inner experience. You do. And that self-awareness, while sometimes painful, is also what makes you capable of profound growth and understanding. So no, you're not fooling yourself. You're not making excuses for social inadequacy. You're accurately recognizing that you experience the world differently than most people. And that difference, while challenging, is also valuable. Let me tell you what the world loses when quiet observers stay silent. It loses the voice that asked the question everyone else was thinking but was too afraid to ask. It loses the perspective that sees what everyone else overlooked. It loses the insight that could have shifted the entire conversation in a more meaningful direction. It loses the person who would have noticed when someone was struggling and reached out quietly. The person who would have remembered the small details that everyone else forgot. The person who would have held space for complexity in a world that constantly demands simplification. Every time you silence yourself out of fear, out of doubt, out of the belief that your contribution doesn't matter, the world becomes a little less nuanced, a little less thoughtful, a little less deep. I'm not saying this to pressure you, I'm saying it because it's true. Your observations matter. Your insights matter. Your quiet presence matters, not because you need to perform or prove anything, but simply because you see things others don't. And seeing, truly seeing, is one of the most valuable things a human being can do. So, here's where we arrive. At the understanding that being a quiet observer is not something to overcome. It's something to inhabit fully. To stop apologizing for your silences and start honoring them as the space where your deepest thinking happens. To stop forcing yourself to speak when you have nothing to say and start trusting that when you do speak, it will carry weight precisely because you don't waste words. To recognize that your way of moving through the world, careful, thoughtful, observant, it's not a flaw in your social programming, it's a feature of your unique design. You're not broken. You're not failing at being human. You're not doing life wrong. You're doing it differently. And that difference, while lonely sometimes, is also what makes you irreplaceable. Because the world has plenty of people who speak without thinking, plenty who react without reflecting, plenty who move through life on autopilot, never questioning, never wondering, never truly seeing. What it needs more of is people like you. People who pause, people who notice, people who watch without needing to interrupt, people who understand that silence is not emptiness, but fullness waiting to be understood. And maybe, just maybe, your quietness is not a burden to overcome, but a gift to finally embrace. There's a specific moment that many quiet observers experience, usually in their 20s or 30s, when they start to realize that their childhood coping mechanism has become their adult identity. You look back and you can't remember when you stopped being a kid who watched, because it was safer, and became an adult who watches because it's who you are. The line blurred somewhere along the way. The survival strategy became personality. The protection became prison. And you start to grieve, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in that same observant way you've always done everything. You grieve for the version of yourself who might have spoken up more, who might have taken more risks, who might have felt less afraid of being seen. You grieve for all the moments you stayed silent when you wanted to speak, all the friendships that stayed surface level because you never let anyone close enough to see the depths. All the experiences you observe from the sidelines instead of jumping in. This grief is important. It's not wallowing, it's acknowledgement. It's your soul saying, I wanted more than this. I wanted to feel less alone. I wanted to be known, not just to know. And sitting with that grief, allowing it to exist without trying to fix it or rationalize it away, that's part of the healing process. Because you can't move forward until you honor what was lost. You can't embrace who you are now until you mourn who you might have been if things had been different. But here's the paradox. The very thing you're grieving, that watchful distance, that careful observation, it's also what's given you gifts most people don't have. You have emotional intelligence that comes from years of studying human behavior. You have depth of thought that comes from spending so much time inside your own mind. You have empathy that comes from knowing what it feels like to be unseen. So the healing isn't about rejecting your observer self, it's about integrating it with the parts of you that want to participate, that want to be seen, that want to connect. It's about becoming both, the watcher and the watched, the listener and the speaker, the analyst and the feeler. Let's talk about what happens when a quiet observer finally finds their people, when they meet someone or a small group of someones who operate at the same frequency. It's like coming home to a place you didn't know existed. Suddenly your pauses aren't awkward. They're understood. Your depth isn't too much. It's welcomed. Your silence isn't interpreted as disinterest. It's recognized as the thoughtful processing it actually is, and for the first time, maybe ever, you don't have to translate yourself. You don't have to edit or perform or carefully calibrate your responses. You can just be. You can say something half-formed, and the other person doesn't look at you like you're strange. They lean in and help you find the rest of the thought. You can sit in comfortable silence, and no one feels the need to fill it with noise. You can share an observation that's been living in your mind for weeks, and instead of blank stares, you get recognition. Oh my God, yes, I've noticed that too. This is what quiet observers are searching for, often without realizing it. Not crowds, not constant social engagement, not to become someone they're not, just one or two people who see them, really see them. And choose to stay anyway. And when you find those people, something shifts inside you. You start to believe that maybe your way of being in the world isn't wrong. Maybe it's just rare. And rare doesn't mean defective, it means valuable. But finding those people requires something difficult for most quiet observers. It requires visibility. You can't be found if you're completely hidden. You can't connect deeply if you never reveal anything deep. You can't be seen if you're always camouflaged in social niceness and surface-level pleasantries. This is the courage required. Not the courage to become extroverted, not the courage to suddenly be the life of the party, but the courage to let yourself be seen as you actually are, to admit when you're thinking too much, to share the observations that feel strange or overly analytical. To say out loud, I know this might sound weird, but I've been thinking about something, to risk being too much for some people, because that's the only way to find the people for whom you're exactly enough. And yes, this is terrifying. Because visibility means vulnerability. It means people might see you and decide you're not what they're looking for. It means rejection is possible. But invisibility, while safer, comes with its own cost. The cost of never being truly known. The cost of relationships that stay perpetually on the surface. The cost of a loneliness that persists even when you're surrounded by people. So the question becomes, which risk feels more bearable? The risk of being seen and potentially rejected, or the risk of staying hidden and definitely alone? There's a practice that can help quiet observers begin to reclaim their voice. It's small, it's simple, but it's powerful. Start noticing when you're self-silencing. When you have a thought or observation but you don't share it, just notice. You don't have to immediately change the behavior. Just become aware of it. What you'll start to realize is how often it happens, how many times a day you edit yourself, how many thoughts you have that never make it past your internal filter. And as you notice, you can start to get curious about why. What's the fear underneath the silence? What's the belief driving the self-editing? Often it's one of these. They won't care, they won't understand, it's not important enough, I'll sound stupid, they'll think I'm weird, I'll disrupt the flow, someone else will say it better. These are the stories your mind tells you to keep you safe. But safe from what exactly? Usually safe from judgment, safe from rejection, safe from the uncomfortable feeling of taking up space, safe from the vulnerability of being truly seen. And those are understandable fears, real fears, valid fears. But living your entire life in service of those fears means your authentic self never gets to breathe, never gets to exist outside your own mind, never gets to find out if maybe, just maybe, people would actually welcome what you have to say. So the practice is this. Notice when you're about to self-silence. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, and then just occasionally speak anyway. Not every time. You don't have to become someone who shares every thought, but sometimes when it feels important. When the silence starts to hurt more than the vulnerability, say the thing, share the observation, ask the question, take up the space, and see what happens. Not with the expectation that it will go perfectly, but with the curiosity of an experiment. What happens when I let myself be seen? Sometimes people won't get it. They'll move on quickly. Your contribution will land flat, and that's okay. That's data. That tells you this isn't your frequency. These aren't your people. But other times, someone's eyes will light up. They'll say, I never thought of it that way. Or that's exactly what I was feeling but couldn't articulate. Or simply, yes. And in those moments, you'll remember why your voice matters, why your observations have value, why your particular way of seeing the world is worth sharing. Let me tell you something about the relationship between observation and creation. Many of the world's greatest artists, writers, filmmakers, and thinkers were quiet observers first. They spent years watching, listening, absorbing, processing, building an internal library of human behavior, emotional patterns, and existential questions. And then, eventually, they found a medium through which to translate all that internal observation into external expression. For some, it's writing. For others, it's visual art, music, film. For some, it's simply the way they show up in their relationships, bringing a depth of understanding and presence that transforms the people around them. The point is, observation doesn't have to stay internal. It can become creation. It can become contribution. It can become the thing you give back to a world that often made you feel like an outsider. Your years of watching weren't wasted. They were research. They were your education in what it means to be human. And now you get to decide what to do with everything you've learned. You get to choose how to translate your inner world into something that exists outside of you. This doesn't mean you have to become an artist or a writer. It just means finding some way to let what you've observed flow outward instead of staying trapped inside. Maybe it's through deep conversations with the people you trust. Maybe it's through mentoring someone younger who reminds you of your younger self. Maybe it's through creating something, anything, that captures even a fraction of what you see and feel and understand. The act of externalizing your inner world is healing, because it reminds you that your observations aren't just for you. They have value beyond your own mind. They can touch others. They can help others feel less alone. And isn't that what you've wanted all along? To not be alone in what you see? To find evidence that others experience the world this way too? Creating, in whatever form it takes for you, is how you send out that signal. It's how you say to the world, I see things deeply. Does anyone else? And somewhere, someone will answer, yes, me too. There's a kind of peace that comes when you finally stop trying to be different than you are, when you stop apologizing for needing time to think before you speak, when you stop forcing yourself to enjoy small talk, when you stop pretending that shallow connections are enough when they're clearly not, when you accept that you're wired for depth, for observation, for careful processing, and that's not going to change no matter how hard you try to be more spontaneous or outgoing or immediately responsive. This acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It doesn't mean giving up on growth or connection or stepping outside your comfort zone. It just means you stop treating your fundamental nature as a problem to solve. You stop reading articles about how to be more confident in conversations and start honouring the fact that your confidence comes from thoughtfulness, not speed. You stop forcing yourself to attend events that drain you and start seeking out environments where your kind of engagement is valued. You stop comparing yourself to people who seem to navigate social situations effortlessly and start appreciating that you navigate emotional complexity effortlessly in ways they never could. This is what self-acceptance looks like for quiet observers. Not becoming louder, not training yourself out of your natural tendencies, but learning to work with them instead of against them. Understanding that your need for solitude isn't antisocial, it's restorative. That your silence in groups isn't disengagement, it's processing. That your careful speech isn't anxiety, it's integrity. When you stop fighting yourself, you free up so much energy. Energy you can use to actually connect instead of performing connection. Energy you can use to create instead of constantly self-monitoring. Energy you can use to be present instead of being anxious about whether you're being present correctly. Here's what I wish someone had told me earlier, what I wish every quiet observer could hear. Your observation is not passive, it's active, it's engaged. It's a form of participation that this world desperately needs more of. In a culture that equates visibility with value, that mistakes volume for importance, that rewards reaction over reflection, your quiet watching is an act of resistance. You're refusing to add to the noise. You're refusing to speak just to fill silence. You're refusing to perform engagement when real engagement happens, in the pauses, in the noticing, in the deep listening. And that refusal, that commitment to depth over display, it matters more than you realize, because every system needs observers. Every conversation needs someone who's truly listening. Every group needs someone who can see the dynamics that everyone else is too busy performing to notice. You're not on the sidelines. You're holding a different position, one that requires different skills, one that contributes in ways that aren't immediately visible but are absolutely essential. So when you feel that familiar ache of invisibility, when you wonder if you matter because you're not the loudest voice in the room, remember this. The roots of a tree are invisible, but they're what keep the whole thing standing. The foundation of a building is hidden, but it's what makes everything above it possible. The most important work often happens in the quiet spaces, in the unseen moments. In the careful attention that no one applauds because they don't even realize it's happening. That's where you live. That's where you work. That's where you contribute. And just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's not profound. So here we are, at the end of this exploration. And maybe you're feeling seen in a way you haven't felt before. Or maybe you're feeling the weight of recognition. The bittersweet ache of finally having words for something you've always experienced but could never quite explain. Both are okay. Both are part of this process. What I hope you take from this is not a solution, not a 5-step plan to stop being a quiet observer, not a promise that it will get easier or that you'll suddenly fit in better. What I hope you take is understanding of yourself, of why you are the way you are, of the beautiful, complicated, deeply human reality of experiencing the world through observation, and with that understanding maybe a little more compassion. For the child you were who learned to watch because it felt safer. For the adult you are who still carries that pattern. For the parts of you that long to be seen and the parts that are terrified of visibility. You're not broken. You never were. You're just wired differently. and different in a world that desperately needs more depth, more thoughtfulness, more genuine observation is exactly what you're meant to be. So keep watching, keep noticing, keep seeing what others miss. But also, when it feels right, when the moment asks for it, when you have something worth sharing, speak. Not because you have to, not because you should, but because your voice, quiet as it is, deserves to be heard. And somewhere, someone is waiting to hear it. Someone who will recognize your frequency. Someone who will lean in instead of moving on. Someone who will finally make you feel less alone in all that watching. Until then, know this. Your silence is not emptiness. Your observation is not absence. Your careful, thoughtful, deeply feeling way of moving through the world is not a flaw. It's a gift to yourself and to anyone wise enough to notice you're there. You've been watching long enough to know the truth, that the quietest people often carry the loudest hearts, that the deepest thinkers often speak the fewest words, that the most profound connections happen not in the noise but in the spaces between. You live in those spaces, and that makes you rare, beautiful, necessary, so don't change. Don't force yourself to be louder or quicker or more like everyone else. Just be exactly as you are, watching, noticing, understanding, and trust that the right people will see you, not despite your quietness, because of it. Before we close, there's one more thing I want you to understand, something practical, something you can carry with you. Being a quiet observer doesn't mean you have to live your entire life in observation mode. It means you have a home frequency, a natural state, but you can also choose to shift when it serves you. Think of it like being bilingual. You have a native language, the language of observation, of deep processing, of thoughtful silence. That's your mother tongue. It's where you're most comfortable, where you think most clearly, where you feel most yourself. But you can also learn to speak the language of participation, of spontaneous contribution, of immediate response. You can develop that skill without abandoning your native tongue. The key is knowing when to use each one, knowing when the situation calls for your observational depth and when it's asking for you to step forward and engage differently. You don't have to choose one or the other, you can be both. Fluid, flexible, choosing consciously instead of defaulting automatically. And this is where real power lives, not in forcing yourself to be someone you're not, but in expanding your range while honouring your core. You can be the quiet observer in the meeting who suddenly speaks up with the insight no one else saw. You can be the thoughtful listener in the conversation who then shares the one comment that shifts everything. You can be the person who watches carefully and then acts decisively. That integration, that wholeness, that's what you're moving toward. Not abandoning observation, but learning when to step out of it and into something else. And finally, as you move through your life, as you continue to navigate this world that often feels too loud, too fast, too superficial, remember this. Every person you observe, every pattern you notice, every insight you gain from all that watching, it's building something inside you. A kind of wisdom that can't be taught, only earned, through time, through attention, through the patient practice of really seeing. That wisdom will serve you. It will serve the people you love. It will serve the work you do in the world. So don't rush it. Don't try to speed up your process. Don't let anyone convince you that your thoughtfulness is slowness or your depth is overthinking. You're exactly where you need to be, processing exactly as you need to process, seeing exactly what you're meant to see. And one day, maybe years from now, you'll look back and realize that all that quiet watching wasn't time wasted. It was time invested in understanding, in empathy, in becoming someone who truly sees, and that, in a world of people who look without seeing, is the rarest gift of all.